G'day and welcome to my series of videos where we use open source software on inexpensive hardware to create a reliable and redundant server environment for small business. Today we are going to create an Active Directory domain controller using a Turnkey Linux container. As you can see, here is my ProxMox virtual environment that I created in other videos. To start with, we need to go to one of our ProxMox nodes. We need to go to the local storage and download the Turnkey Domain Controller template. Now, I've already downloaded it, but if you need to get it, click Templates here, type Domain, and then in the list here you can click Download, download it, and within about 5 minutes it will then display here. The other thing you'll need is a Windows 10 virtual machine. I've created mine and it is ready to go. On the Windows 10 virtual machine you must be running Windows 10 Pro and you need to install the RSAT tools. So to do that, go to Settings, then Apps, then go Optional Features, add a feature, and then if you type RSAT, the one you'll need is the Active Directory Domain Services and Lightweight Directory Services tool. So let's get that installing and we'll come back to that later. So the next thing we need to do is create the container. So go to the top of your node there, click Create Container, and then create your hostname. I'm going to use DC1. This is important. You need to make sure it's a privileged container. Otherwise you'll run into problems with the setup of the domain controller once you get the container up and running. Create a root password here. And then under the template, pick the domain controller template you downloaded earlier. Now, if you're running a very small business, maybe about 15 computers or so, you don't really need a lot of disk space for a domain controller, so this 8 gig should be more than fine. Again, you also will probably not need more than 1 core and no more than 512 mega memory. Now, to make it simple, we'll turn off the firewall for this container. I might make a video later on where we discuss security hardening and how we can use a firewall with ProxMox, but for now let's turn it off to keep it simple. Put an IP address in, a fixed IP address that is in the same subnet as what your router is, and then obviously set the router as your gateway. On this screen where it has DNS domain, put the domain name that you'll be using for your domain controller. Now for some businesses you probably have registered a domain name, so you would simply put that in there. And if your ProxMox is using the same DNS server as your container, which is the router on your small business network, then you can just leave this alone. Okay, we'll click Finish, and it will start creating the container. Now this will take maybe a couple of minutes, 5 minutes or so. In the meantime, we can check and see how our installation of our RSAT tool is going. And as you can see here, it says it's installed. We will click Close here, and we will go here, and we will check it's there by typing Active Directory users and computers, and there it is there. At the moment we don't have a domain controller, so this will show up with nothing. So we are now almost ready to go on our Windows 10 client. If we go back to our container, we can see here that it has been created, which is good. So if we now go to our container in ProxMox here, before we start the container, another very important thing we have to do, and that is under Options, we have to go to Features and we have to set Nesting. That is because if we want to access Webmin in our Turnkey container, there's a couple of things it does using SSL tunneling and that if you don't have this nesting feature enabled, you will not be able to then get to Webmin. The other thing we probably want to do is make sure that if our cluster for some reason loses power, that the machine will always load back up when we start at boot. Yeah, we won't get too much into detail about high availability or anything like that. We can cover that in another video. So at this stage we can go to the console and we can click the Start button to start our container. Because this is the first time that the container has been run, it will go through a setup phase, which will take a bit longer than usual. And as you can kind of see there, it's setting up components of the domain controller. So log on there with the root password you specified when you created the container. And as you can see, Turnkey Linux gives you a menu that makes it really easy to configure your Active Directory domain controller. So we're going to create a new one. The one I'm going to use is my domain name that I have registered and uses the basis for all of my work. The net BIOS name is usually just the first part of your domain name. The important thing here is this is for older Windows clients, and it needs to be less than 15 characters. Okay, now you've got to create a password for your domain administrator account. Once you do that, it will start running more scripts to reconfigure your domain as specified. So again, this will take a little bit of time. Okay, now at this point in time, if you have registered a Turnkey account, you can add your API key here, and that would help you then manage your domain controller, getting it backed up and various things like that. For now, I'm just going to skip this step. I will, however, put my email address. If you've got any questions, you can contact me on that email address. I'm going to put that in there so that any notifications from this will go to my email address. And I will, as part of this, install the updates. Now this happens automatically as well if you leave the container running, but it's always good practice to start your box with the latest updates. In particular here you can see there's quite a few for Samba, which is the underlying software that allows this domain controller to work. You can see here now that it now has downloaded and it's applying these changes. Okay, now this here is the Turnkey Console if you've never seen it before, and it kind of gives you an idea of how you can access further management tools. The management tool that most likely will be used is this one, Webmin here. So I'm going to copy that address, and in a new tab I'm going to paste, and I'm going to add that address to be looked at. Now, it sometimes is common the very first time that you run Webmin that it can take a moment or so to get connected, and this is also it's very popular. Now if you don't get this far, it's likely because that nesting tick box that covered earlier in the video, you missed that spot, so you just have to start from scratch. But if we sign in here, we will see now on the left hand side that we have a Samba Webmin module. You can see it's created a net logon and a sys file, which is important for an Active Directory, and it's configured everything else. The great thing about Turnkey Linux is it does some very complicated stuff very easily. It ties it all into a very simple template that you can install in a container, and that's why it's possible to do this within seconds. In fact, I'd argue this is quicker than if you were to use the Microsoft equivalent, installing that from the ground up. Anyway, back to the task at hand. There's a couple of things that may become a problem later on, and I'll show you now. So the Samba is the underlying software that runs all of this, and if I go system control status and I pull up the Samba DC service, you can see that it's active and running, and it's looking great. I might give that a restart, give that an idea to see if that will still work, and today it's running well. Occasionally you might see that it hasn't started properly. You might find that it's not working there. One of the common things is there's another service that interferes with the DNS part of Samba. So to understand it a bit more, the Samba Active Directory actually has its own DNS server that is used to respond to Active Directory specific DNS requests. But it's quite common also for systemd to have its own, get the spelling right here, systemd resolve, oh there we go, silly user hyphen. It's quite often a problem that the systemd resolve service gets in the way. It also can take the same TCP port as what Samba can use. So my recommendation is to avoid problems down the track is to disable the systemd resolve service. So we'll disable that. Now let's test to make sure we haven't broken anything too much by now rebooting the container. With any luck, the container will now reboot. If I go type my root password, go back into here, pull up systemctl status of our Samba environment, it still says it's active and running fine. For all intents and purposes, we now have a working domain controller. So how can we test this? Well, we can go back to our Windows box and test it. Now you may recall that if I go back here, I've got this as my IP address, 192.168.1.29. You'll have one that's set up for your subnet. If you have a DHCP server on your subnet, you need to change it so that its DNS server, now that it hands out as part of DHCP, now becomes your domain controller. Any requests then that are for Samba, for Active Directory, would go to will be resolved by Samba. Anything that isn't resolved by Samba, anything it can't figure out, it will then pass to this container's DNS server, which of course is your router. So that's how it can still get out to the internet, but still resolve your Active Directory specific entries. For testing purposes, you may not be at a stage where you want to create a DHCP entry and modify that to begin with. So what you can do is you can, on your Windows 10 box that you're testing with, you can just manually set an IP address on your subnet. And I'm just going to make one up. There's my router, but what I'm going to do here is I'm going to put the IP address of my domain controller. I click save here now. You can see now that that is applied. If I go to the Edge, which it looks like, of course, being a new version of Windows that I've just installed, it's going to go through the setup. If I go here and do a random internet search, you can see I've still got internet. All my stuff is resolving, it's just resolving via the domain controller's DNS. But the good news is now if I go to join my domain, which I can never remember how to do since they made Windows 10. I might go here and do it actually, right click system. Might have better luck doing it this way, and then I think if you go advanced system settings here, there we go. This is the familiar place to join your domain. So I go here, I've got my Windows 10-test. I'm going to go here and I'm going to put in boxes.id.au, which is my domain that I created in the domain controller. Now it's going to ask me for the password. Well, the domain administrator account that we created is administrator, and then the password is what you would have set as part of the setup wizard. So here we go. Welcome to the domain. This is very good news. So if I now reboot my Windows 10 virtual machine, which hopefully won't take too long. The interesting thing about this as it's booting is the inexpensive hardware I'm using for this is actually an Intel NUC I picked up on Gumtree for about $150. 16 gig of memory is in it, it's an i5 processor, and I'm running the domain controller and I'm running the Windows 10 client on it, and it's actually not too bad. So here we can now go other user, and you can see it's got my domain name for my domain controller. We've only got one user at the moment on our domain, which is the domain administrator. To actually log on to that properly, you're going to have to use boxes/administrator or whatever you created your domain name with, and then of course the password that you would have created as part of that wizard. And being Windows 10 now, it's going to go through the process of saying, hi, I'm a new user. Oh, much fun. So just to give you an idea while that's configuring, if we go back over here, we can have a look at how much memory is being used by our domain controller. Only 188 megabytes of memory, and as you can see, it's barely using that CPU, which is why this is appealing for small businesses on inexpensive hardware, because the Microsoft equivalent uses much memory these days. In fact, I think they're up to recommending 16 gig of memory, I think, for most Windows servers that need to run in a small business environment. Anyhow, so here's my Windows 10 now logged on with the domain administrator. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go to Active Directory, Users and Computers. If I click on that, you can now see my domain that I created. And you can kind of see now if I go computers here, here's my Windows 10 computer. So this is acting exactly like a Microsoft domain from Windows 2000 onwards would. You can see my domain controller in there, and under users you can see my users. Now if I want to, I can create a new user, and I will. I'll create a test account. Now it even has its own domain password complexities. So if I try to create a basic password, it will reject it because there's all of that in there. So it's actually quite powerful, so I'm going to make it a bit more complicated. And of course all of this is configurable, and we'll cover that in later videos. But now I've got my new user. Go back to users there. Where is my user? Make sure you create it in the right folder. As you can see though, the functionality is there just to move things as it would be in a normal. Actually, I wonder if I can create a domain organizational unit. I can. That's brilliant. So I can actually start putting my users into folders, which this is useful for later if we want to create group policy, which I'll again cover in another video. Anyway, The important thing is now I've created a new user, so let me log out here. And I'll log on now with the other user. Remember that was my here we go. So again, it's just now logged on with the new user I have created. We're up to 190 meg now, but still nowhere near the 512 meg. So it's fantastic. As I said before, it doesn't require very much disk space at all. Even if you were to create another 100 users on this, you'd be nowhere near the 8 gig that's there. So that's just fantastic. If we go back now to my Windows 10, which is there, you can see I'm now logged on as a new user, and to give you an idea that I am a domain user, I'll go to the device manager. This is always fun, and as you can see, it's saying I'm a standard user, I'm not as an administrator, and therefore I cannot do any more work with this. So you can see you get the full domain security that would come with a normal Windows domain. So there you have it. A domain controller provided by Turnkey Linux that runs on the ProxMox virtual environment that took me not very long to set up, and has all the power and redundancy that you can get with ProxMox. So if I wanted to, I could create a replication. I could make it replicate every 15 minutes or so to another node, so I've got the high availability there. I can back up my domain controller. I'd actually have to connect another disk or a shared disk there, but I could make it perform a backup. I can make it perform a backup on a routine. I can snapshot it, so if I'm worried about a change I'm making, I can do that. Of course, in a later video I'll talk a little more about security hardening with the firewall there. And in the cluster here, I mean, you can see a range of things that I run. But under HA here, if I wanted to, I could actually find my domain controller there. I can make sure it's always restarted. If I set these to 0, it'll always try to start the box. And as you can see, I've now got it as high availability. So it's replicated between this node and this node. If for some reason on the DC1 here stops working, it will automatically, or this node stops working, it'll keep it going on the other PVE node that is there. So incredibly safe and reliable, and perfect for small businesses who are quite cash strapped and are looking for a better way of managing their users and devices, but don't have the money to afford the Microsoft software. Alright, my name is Solomon Box, and for more videos have a look at my channel. Take care.